The morning of December 3, 1887, dawned at 22 degrees below zero, and by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge above Copper Creek, the temperature had fallen another 4 degrees. 847 souls woke that morning to find the creek itself, the waterway that had given the town its name and its life for 31 years, frozen solid for the first time in living memory. Ice stretched from bank to bank in a thick blue sheet that would have held a loaded freight wagon, though no freight wagon had arrived from Fort Benson for 5 consecutive days now. The killing winter that old-timers would later call the White Death had entered its third week with no sign of breaking, and the town's provisions were dwindling with terrible speed. Snow stood 7 feet deep against buildings along Main Street, and the men who emerged each morning to clear paths did so with the grim efficiency of soldiers digging trenches. Livestock were dying in barns despite every effort to keep them warm. Horses found stiff-legged at their posts. Cattle collapsed in heaps against walls where they had huddled for warmth that never came. The general store's shelves, which had seemed so abundant in October, now held perhaps 8 days of provisions for a town that had never known true scarcity. The owner, Josiah Finch, had begun rationing flour and salt pork 3 days prior, and the lines that formed each morning grew longer and more desperate with each passing dawn. If you find yourself drawn into this story of survival and community, consider subscribing to the channel for more tales of frontier resilience. And take a moment to like this video if it captures your attention. Prudence Prescott stood at the window of her small cabin on the hillside above town, watching the smoke rise from chimneys below. She counted them as she did each morning, 112 columns of gray against the white sky, and noted which had grown thinner, which had stopped altogether. The Yancey homestead had not shown smoke for 2 days now, and she wondered if young Thomas had managed to reach his aunt's place in town, or if he was still trying to keep his family's fire burning with green wood that would not catch. She turned from the window and crossed to the heavy oak door that led not outside but deeper into the hillside. The door swung open on oiled hinges, revealing a vestibule 3 feet deep, lined with packed earth and straw, and beyond it a second door of equal thickness. When she passed through both and descended the 3 stone steps into her root cellar, the cold that had gripped her shoulders released its hold. The air here held steady at 40 degrees, as it had held steady through the blazing heat of August, and would hold steady through whatever depths this winter might yet reach. 823 glass jars lined the 18 tiers of shelving that stretched along both walls, and in the light of her lantern they glowed like windows into summer. Ruby preserves of wild plum and chokecherry, amber jars of pickled corn and beans, the deep purple of preserved beets, the pale gold of rendered tallow, and the cloudy white of pickled eggs floating in brine. Each jar bore a label in her careful hand, noting contents and date, and each jar represented hours of labor in the garden she had carved from rocky soil, hours of picking and blanching and sealing in the kitchen that had run hot as a forge through 3 summers. She had built this place with her own hands, and $412 she could not afford to spend. She had built it because her grandmother Moira had made her swear to remember. 4 years earlier, in the spring of 1883, Prudence had arrived in Copper Creek on the weekly stage from Helena, carrying a single trunk, wearing mourning black, and holding a leather journal so worn that its binding had been reinforced twice with sailmaker's thread. She was 26 years old, a widow of 3 years whose husband had died of typhoid fever before they could start a family, and she had just buried the last person on earth who loved her. Moira Brennan Prescott had died of pneumonia on March 15, 1882, in the small sod house on the Scottish immigrant settlement in Minnesota, where she had raised Prudence from the age of 7. The old woman had survived 3 Highland famines before emigrating, had crossed the ocean with nothing but her knowledge and her stubbornness, and had spent her final years teaching her granddaughter everything she knew about staying alive when the world turned hostile. The death had taken 3 weeks. Moira had known from the first cough that she would not see spring, and she had used those weeks not for sentiment, but for instruction. She made Prudence recite the journal's contents from memory: the dimensions of a proper root cellar, the angle of ventilation shafts, the signs in bird flight and animal bones that foretold harsh winters. She made her granddaughter describe the cellars she had built in the highlands, carved into hillsides where frost could not reach, their walls lined with stones mortared against seepage and fitted with double doors to trap the earth's steady warmth. On the night before she died, Moira had gripped Prudence's hand with fingers that felt like dry sticks and said, "The land will tell you what it means to do, if you are quiet enough to hear it. Others will laugh. Let them fill their mouths with laughter now. Come winter, they will need them empty for bread." Prudence had written those words on the inside cover of the journal, and she had carried them west to Montana Territory because Minnesota held nothing for her anymore except a grave and memories of a better time. Copper Creek had seemed as good a place as any to start over. The valley was broad and fertile, the town prosperous with cattle money, and land was available for homesteading on the slopes that the ranchers did not want. Prudence had spent her first week walking the territory with a surveyor's eye, ignoring the lush bottomland near the creek and the gentle slopes already dotted with homesteads. She had climbed instead to the rocky hillside on the valley's western edge, where granite shelves jutted from the earth like the bones of some ancient creature. And she had felt the ground's temperature with her bare hands at dawn and dusk for 7 consecutive days. The land office clerk had thought her touched in the head when she filed for 40 acres of what he called goat pasture. Ephraim Coldwell himself had been standing at the counter that day, a man whose Coldwell Cattle Company controlled 60% of the valley's commerce and whose opinion shaped the town's collective judgment on most matters. He had looked at the survey map and laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement. "That hillside is fit only for burying the dead," he had said. "What does a widow want with a graveyard?" Prudence had met his eyes without flinching. "What I want with my land is my own concern, Mr. Coldwell." He had found that amusing as well, in a different way, and she had seen something harden behind his smile. Ephraim Coldwell was not accustomed to being answered back, particularly by women, and most particularly by women who had no family, no money, and no standing in his town. If this story speaks to you, consider ringing the bell icon to receive updates when new tales of frontier wisdom are shared here. She had named her horse Hickory for the warm palomino gold of his coat, and he had been her only companion during the first summer of digging. The work had been brutal. She had broken 3 pickaxes on the granite before learning to read the stone's grain and strike where it would fracture cleanly. She had hauled rubble by the cartload down the hillside, dumping it into a ravine that slowly filled with the evidence of her labor. Her hands had cracked and bled until calluses formed thick as saddle leather, and her shoulders had developed a permanent ache that would never fully leave her. The cellar had begun as a hole in the hillside, 12 feet deep and 10 feet wide, carved from living rock with nothing but hand tools and a stubbornness she had inherited from Moira along with the journal. She had studied her grandmother's sketches by lamplight each evening, memorizing the angles of the ventilation shafts that would allow air to circulate without letting cold seep in, the design of the vestibule that would serve as a buffer between the cellar's steady warmth and the outside world's extremes. By the end of that first summer, she had spent $118 on mortar, timber for shoring, and the services of a stonemason from Helena, who had agreed to teach her proper wall construction in exchange for 3 days of meals and $50 in coin. The stonemason, a Welshman named Davies who had worked mine shafts before turning to gentler labor, had looked at her excavation and her grandmother's sketches, and had said nothing for a long moment. "Your grandmother was a clever woman," he had finally said. "This will work, if you build it true. Most people do not understand that stone breathes. Your grandmother did." He had taught her to lay stones with their faces slightly tilted, allowing moisture to weep down and away rather than pooling against the mortar. He had shown her how to fit ventilation shafts with baffles that would prevent wind from creating drafts while still allowing air to move, and he had watched her work for those 3 days with a growing respect that he did not bother to hide. "You will outlast them all," he had said when he left, "the ones who think they know everything. They always break first." Prudence had not known then how prophetic those words would prove. The second summer had cost $164 in oak planking for the doors and shelving, iron hardware for hinges and latches, and glass jars purchased by the gross from a supplier in St. Louis. The shelving alone had taken her 3 weeks to construct, 18 tiers on each wall, each shelf reinforced to bear the weight of dozens of filled jars. She had built the double doors from oak 4 inches thick, fitting them with rubber seals she had cut from an old wagon cover, creating an airlock that would trap the cellar's stable temperature inside. The townspeople had begun to notice by then. Her trips to the general store for supplies had drawn curious looks and eventually questions that she answered with as few words as possible. What was she building up there on the hillside? What did she want with so many glass jars? Did she not know that a woman alone could not survive a Montana winter without help? She had let them talk. She had learned from Moira that explaining oneself to those determined not to understand was a waste of breath better spent on labor. The third summer had cost $130 in additional supplies and every hour of daylight she could steal from other necessary work. Her garden had produced abundantly that year. The rocky soil, once cleared and amended with manure from a rancher who considered it garbage, had proved surprisingly fertile. She had learned which vegetables preserved best, which methods of canning held longest, and how to read the subtle signs that told her when a jar's seal had failed. By the time the first snow fell in October of 1886, she had 700 jars on her shelves, and she had begun planning for the 800. The cellar's temperature had held steady through the summer's worst heat, and she had spent several nights sleeping in its cool embrace when her cabin above became unbearable. She had known then that her grandmother's design was sound, that the hillside granite conducted the earth's deep warmth exactly as Moira had promised. But knowledge and proof are different things, and the proof would not come until the winter of 1887, when the cold descended like a predator and the town below began to starve. This act of the story pauses here, but the winter's grip is only beginning to tighten. Like the video and subscribe to witness what comes next. The cold that gripped Copper Creek in those early December days carried a weight that went beyond temperature. It pressed against windows like something alive, seeking entry, patient and relentless. Prudence had felt this kind of cold only once before, in Minnesota during the winter of 1879, when Moira had kept them alive in their sod house by burning furniture and sleeping pressed together beneath every blanket they owned. That winter had killed 11 people in the settlement, and Moira had spoken of it only once afterward, saying simply, "The land tried to take us, and we refused to go." Now Prudence stood in her root cellar, counting jars as she did each morning, running her fingers along the glass surfaces that held summer's abundance captive against winter's siege. 823. Each one a small victory against the White Death settling over the valley. Each one a promise she had made to herself and to the memory of a woman who had known what it meant to survive when others did not. She climbed the stone steps, passed through the vestibule, and emerged into her cabin. The fire in the iron stove had burned low during her inspection, and she added 2 splits of pine before crossing to the window that faced the town below. The smoke columns had thinned further overnight. She counted 109 now, 3 fewer than yesterday, and she wondered which families had run out of fuel or fled to crowd in with neighbors whose supplies were hardly more abundant. The memories of building this place came to her unbidden, as they often did during quiet moments. She remembered the look on Davis's face when he had first seen her excavation, the way his weathered features had shifted from skepticism to something approaching wonder. He had returned the following summer uninvited, appearing at her hillside on a June morning with his tools and a proposition. "I will help you finish the walls," he had said, "for the cost of materials and nothing more. I want to see if your grandmother's design holds true." They had worked together for 2 weeks, and in that time Davies had taught her things that no book could convey. How to feel when mortar had reached the proper consistency, how to listen for the subtle click that meant a stone had found its natural seat, how to judge by touch alone whether a joint would hold for decades or fail within years. He had asked her about Moira, and she had found herself telling him things she had told no one else. How her grandmother had walked 6 miles through a highland blizzard to reach a neighbor's cellar when their own roof collapsed. How she had fed 12 people for 3 weeks from provisions others had mocked her for storing. How she had buried 4 of them anyway when the cold proved stronger than the food. "She sounds like a woman who understood that the world does not care whether we live or die," Davies had said. "It only offers opportunities for those wise enough to see them." The second summer's work had transformed the raw excavation into something approaching her grandmother's vision. The walls rose, true and solid, mortared stones fitted with the precision that Davies had demanded and she had learned to match. The ventilation shafts angled upward at precisely 17 degrees, emerging on the hillside through disguised openings that would draw fresh air in and push stale air out without creating drafts that could upset the temperature balance. She had spent $43 on the copper screening that covered these openings, preventing insects and small animals from entering while still allowing air to flow. The vestibule had been her own addition to Moira's design, born from observation of how heat escaped each time she opened her cabin door. 3 feet of earth-packed space between the outer and inner doors, lined with straw for additional insulation, creating an airlock that trapped the cellar's steady warmth even when the outer door stood open for loading or unloading. The concept had come to her in a dream, Moira's voice explaining something she had never actually said, and Prudence had woken with the design complete in her mind. If you are finding value in this story of preparation and foresight, subscribing to this channel will ensure you witness how Prudence's work is tested against the coming storm. The townspeople's curiosity had curdled into something uglier during that second summer. Prudence had grown accustomed to the stares when she purchased supplies at the general store, the way conversations quieted when she entered and resumed in whispers when she turned her back. She had learned to ignore the pointing fingers of children who had been told stories about the strange widow on the hillside, and the pitying looks of women who believed her grief had unbalanced her mind. But it was Ephraim Coldwell who gave voice to what others only muttered. She had been loading jars into her wagon outside the general store on an August afternoon, 200 glass vessels purchased from Josiah Finch, at a cost that had made the store owner raise his eyebrows and count the money twice. Coldwell had emerged from the saloon across the street, where he spent most afternoons conducting the business of his cattle empire over whiskey and cards, and he had crossed to stand beside her wagon with the proprietary air of a man who believed all of Copper Creek belonged to him. 200 more jars, he had said, loudly enough for the half-dozen townspeople within earshot to hear clearly. "Tell me, Widow Prescott, what exactly do you mean to put in all those jars? You cannot possibly eat that much food alone, unless you have grown 3 stomachs like one of my cattle." She had continued loading, not meeting his eyes. "I preserve what my garden grows, Mr. Coldwell. What I do with my provisions is my own concern. Your own concern." He had laughed, that same short bark she remembered from the land office. "I've been asking around about you, widow. They say your grandmother was touched in the head back in Minnesota, kept a cellar full of food while her neighbors went hungry, talked to herself about famines that happened before any of them were born. They say she died muttering about cold that was coming to kill everyone." Prudence's hands had stilled on the jar she was lifting. "My grandmother survived 3 famines in Scotland before she ever came to this country. She knew what hunger meant. And apparently, she passed her madness on to you. Coldwell had stepped closer, lowering his voice to something that might have been mistaken for concern by anyone who did not see the cruelty in his eyes. People are talking, widow. They say you are building yourself a tomb up there on the hillside. They say you are digging your own grave and filling it with food you will never eat, like some squirrel too added to remember where it buried its nuts. He had paused, savoring his next words. They are calling it the Widow's Folly. The name had caught like fire in dry grass. Within a week, everyone in Copper Creek knew it. The children sang it as a rhyme when they saw her wagon pass. The men repeated it in the saloon with variations that grew cruder with each telling. The women used it in their parlors and kitchens, shaking their heads over the sad case of the widow who had lost her senses along with her husband and her grandmother. Margaret Coldwell had made certain that the exclusion was complete and public. At the Ladies' Auxiliary meeting that September, she had announced that membership required sponsorship by 2 existing members and payment of annual dues, requirements that had never existed before and which everyone understood were designed for a single purpose. When the church social committee organized the harvest dance, Prudence's name was pointedly absent from the list of invited spinsters and widows. When the quilting circle met each Wednesday afternoon at the parsonage, no one knocked on her cabin door to ask if she cared to join. She builds her own tomb up there, Margaret had said at one such gathering, loud enough for Prudence to hear as she passed the parsonage window. And I reckon she will die in it alone and crazy, just like her grandmother before her. Mark my words, that cellar will be the death of her. It is unnatural, digging into the earth like some burrowing creature. A woman ought to trust in Providence and her community, not in jars and stones. Prudence had heard every word, and she had kept walking without breaking stride. That evening, with the autumn air carrying the first hint of the cold months to come, she had stood in her barn brushing Hickory's pale coat, working the dust and tangles from his mane with slow, methodical strokes. The horse had turned his head to watch her with the calm intelligence that had made her choose him from the string of animals available at the Helena livery 4 years before, and she had found herself speaking aloud for the first time in days. "They think I am mad, Hickory." Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, rusty from disuse. "They think I am building a tomb. Perhaps they are right about one thing. I am preparing for death, but not my own." The horse had snorted softly, as if in agreement. The elk came down from the high country 6 weeks early this year. I watched them cross the ridge above Miller's Creek, 40 head or more, moving like something was driving them. The geese went south in October, a full month before their usual time, and they flew without stopping to rest on the lake as they always do. The caterpillars I found last week were solid black, every one of them, no brown bands at all. She had stopped brushing, her hand resting on Hickory's warm flank. "And the birds, Hickory, the birds that come to my feeder each winter, the juncos and the sparrows and the chickadees. They have not come, not a single one. The feeders I hung in September are still full, the seeds untouched. They know something. They feel it in the air and the earth, and they have gone where we cannot follow." The horse had turned his head fully then, pressing his muzzle against her shoulder in the gesture of comfort he had offered since she first brought him home. Grandmother knew how to read these signs. She taught me, and I tried to tell them. I told Reverend Hollister what I saw in the animals. He patted my arm like I was a child frightened of shadows and suggested I spend more time in prayer and less time communing with creatures. A bitter smile had crossed her face. Communing with creatures. As if the creatures do not speak more clearly than any sermon. She had pressed her forehead against the horse's neck, feeling his warmth, his steady heartbeat, his patient presence. "Let them fill their mouths with laughter now, Hickory. Let them call my cellar a tomb and my preparation folly. Winter is coming. Winter like they have never seen. And when it arrives, when their barns are empty, and their children are hungry, and their laughter has turned to prayers, they will remember the widow on the hillside. They will remember what they called her. And they will have to decide what they are willing to swallow to survive. The third summer's work had completed the project that Moira had envisioned decades before in the Scottish Highlands. Prudence had spent $130 on the final supplies. More jars, lids, rubber seals, salt and sugar and vinegar by the barrel for pickling and preserving. She had expanded her garden to nearly 2 acres, breaking ground that fought her at every strike, amending soil that seemed more stone than earth until it yielded crops that surprised even her own modest expectations. The canning had consumed every spare moment from June through October. She had risen before dawn and worked until full dark, blanching and packing and sealing until her hands cramped and her back screamed and her eyes blurred from the steam rising from her kettles. She had learned to judge by sound alone when a jar had sealed properly, the sharp pop of the lid drawing inward as the contents cooled and contracted. She had developed a system for rotating stock. Oldest jars to the front, newest to the back, labels updated each season with careful notes about contents and quality. By the time the first snow fell, she had 823 jars on her shelves, and she had begun storing root vegetables in sand-filled boxes along the cellar floor, turnips and parsnips and potatoes that would keep through any winter the land could offer. She had laid in firewood enough for 2 winters stacked against her cabin's north wall, and she had purchased extra grain for hickory at prices that made other buyers shake their heads at her extravagance. The autumn of 1887 had brought signs that even she found disturbing. The beaver dams she checked each October showed walls built higher than she had ever seen, the animals working with frantic determination to raise their structures against some threat only they could sense. The squirrels had buried their caches deeper, digging down past the frost line that normally satisfied their instincts. The bears had eaten until their sides bulged, disappearing into their dens 3 weeks earlier than usual. And then had come the warm spell in early November, 3 days of temperatures that climbed above freezing and melted the early snow into mud and false hope. The townspeople had celebrated, declaring the winter broken before it had properly begun, crowding into the saloon to toast their good fortune. Ephraim Coldwell had bought drinks for the house and proclaimed that this would be the mildest winter in memory, that his cattle would thrive and his profits would double. Prudence had watched the warm wind with growing dread. She knew what it meant. She had read about it in Moira's journal, the false springs that came before the killing cold, the last breath of gentleness before the land turned murderous. The warmth melted snow that would freeze again into ice, coating every surface with a glaze that would trap animals and kill plants and make the coming cold 10 times more deadly. She had tried one final time to warn them. At the general store, purchasing the last supplies she expected to need before spring, she had spoken to Josiah Finch about laying in extra provisions. "The warm spell is a warning, not a blessing," she had said. "The cold that follows will be worse than anything this valley has seen." Finch had smiled with the patient condescension of a man who knew better. "Now, Widow Prescott, I know you fancy yourself a weather prophet, but my grandfather lived in this valley for 30 years, and he always said a November thaw meant a mild winter to follow. The cold has blown itself out early, that is all. We will have an easy season." He had been dead wrong, and 3 weeks later the town would begin to learn exactly how wrong. But on that November afternoon, Prudence had simply nodded, completed her purchase, and driven her wagon back up the hillside to the cellar that everyone called her tomb and her folly. November 19th arrived wrapped in silence. The warm spell had ended 3 days before, temperatures dropping with a speed that left frost on windows an inch thick. But the morning of the 19th brought something different, a stillness in the air that felt like held breath, a quality of light that seemed to drain color from the world. Prudence had woken before dawn with a feeling in her chest that she recognized from childhood, from the night before her parents died in the fever that orphaned her, from the morning of Moira's final breath. The thermometer outside her window read 38 degrees below zero. She had never seen the mercury that low. The glass tube looked like it might crack from the cold it measured, the silver line huddled at the bottom as if trying to escape. Her breath froze in her lungs before she could fully exhale, and she felt ice crystals forming in her nostrils with each inhalation. This was the cold that had followed her across an ocean in her grandmother's stories. This was the predator that had killed crops and cattle and people in the highlands, patient and absolute, cracking stones and splitting trees and freezing birds in mid-flight. This was what the elk and the geese and the missing sparrows had known was coming. This was the winter Moira had survived 3 times and had spent her dying days teaching Prudence to survive as well. The cold would hold below 20 degrees below zero for 61 consecutive days, though no one knew that yet on the morning it arrived. What they knew was that livestock began dying within hours, that water pipes burst like cannon fire throughout the town, that the creek froze so solid and so fast that fish could be seen suspended in the ice like specimens in glass cases. What they knew was that the freight wagon from Fort Benson did not arrive that day, or the next, or any day for weeks to come. What they knew was that the provisions in the general store, which had seemed adequate for any normal winter, would not be adequate for this. And what Prudence knew, standing in her root cellar surrounded by 823 glowing jars, was that she had built something that might just save them all, if they could bring themselves to accept help from the mad widow they had mocked. The White Death settled over Copper Creek like a shroud drawn by patient hands. For the first 3 days, the town held its breath and waited. Surely the cold would break. Surely the mercury would climb. Surely the freight wagon would appear on the horizon, its driver half frozen but alive, bringing flour and salt and the reassurance that the outside world had not forgotten them. But the cold did not break. The mercury did not climb, and no wagon appeared on any horizon, because the passes had closed with snow so deep that no horse could push through it, no wheel could turn in it, no man could survive walking through it for more than an hour. Prudence watched from her hillside as the town began to understand what she had known since the elk came down early, and the geese fled south a month ahead of schedule. She watched the smoke columns, 109 on that first morning of the true cold, and counted them each dawn as they flickered and thinned and one by one began to disappear. The general store roof collapsed on December 8th, 18 days into the siege. Prudence heard the distant crash from her cabin, a sound like thunder trapped underground, and she walked to the edge of her property where the land dropped away toward the valley floor. Through air so cold it seemed to shatter light itself, she could see the ruin where Josiah Finch's establishment had stood. The weight of accumulated snow, 7 feet deep by then, with drifts twice that against southern walls, had proven too much for timbers that had seemed adequate for 30 years of ordinary winters. Half the remaining provisions in Copper Creek lay buried under collapsed beams and shattered glass, and the temperature stood at 29 degrees below zero with no sign of warming. She thought of Finch smiling with patient condescension as he explained that a November thaw meant mild weather to follow. She wondered if he was smiling now, standing in the frozen rubble of his grandfather's certainty. The Coldwell hay barns burned 2 days later. The fire started, as fires in desperate times often do, from an act of desperate hope. Cowboys trying to keep the remaining cattle alive had brought braziers into the barns, small iron baskets of burning coal meant to raise the temperature just enough to prevent the animals from freezing where they stood. But cold that profound does strange things to fire. The flames leaped sideways instead of up, caught dry hay that should have been too frozen to burn, and spread with a speed that seemed impossible in air that turned breath to ice. 3,000 head of cattle died that night, some in the fire itself, some in the chaos of the escape attempt, and some simply standing in the fields where they had fled, freezing solid before the flames finished consuming the barns behind them. Ephraim Coldwell lost 60% of his herd in 6 hours. The man who controlled 60% of the valley's commerce stood in the orange light of his burning empire and watched his certainty turn to ash and blown snow. Prudence heard about the fire from Hickory, in a manner of speaking. The mare had grown restless in her small stable, stamping and snorting at some disturbance Prudence could not identify until she stepped outside and saw the glow on the horizon, orange against the black and white world that Copper Creek had become. She stood in cold that burned her lungs and watched the light flicker and fade, and she thought of Ephraim Coldwell calling her cellar a tomb, calling her grandmother crazy, declaring that she would die alone in the hole she had dug for herself. "The world has a way of teaching humility," she said to the darkness, "and its lessons are not gentle." The deaths began in earnest during the 3rd week. Young Thomas Yancey was the first that Prudence knew by name, though she learned later that others had died before him, unnamed homesteaders on the far edges of the valley, found frozen in their cabins when neighbors finally managed to reach them. Thomas was 14 years old, the eldest son of the family whose homestead lay 3 miles north of town, and he died doing what young men in hard country had always done, trying to help. His father sent him with messages to neighboring farms, checking on elderly residents, carrying word of who had supplies and who had need. The distance was not far, perhaps a mile each way through territory Thomas had walked 100 times. But cold at 32 degrees below zero is not the same as cold at zero, and a mile through waist-deep snow is not the same as a mile on packed earth. They found Thomas a quarter-mile from the Hendricks place, his body half buried in a drift he had tried to push through. His hands were still extended before him, frozen in the act of reaching for help that never came. He was wearing his father's coat, too large for him, and his face held an expression of simple surprise, as if the cold had taken him so quickly that he never understood what was happening. The Lindqvist infant died 3 days later, and this death carried a weight that bent the town's spirit in ways the others had not. Eric Lindqvist had built his cabin strong and tight, had laid in what he thought was adequate firewood, had done everything a prudent man might do to protect his family. But the cold found a way, as the cold always does. A crack in the chinking that would have been nothing in an ordinary winter became a channel for air so cold it lowered the temperature inside the cabin faster than the fire could warm it. The family huddled closer around the hearth, fed the flames with everything that would burn, and still the cold crept in. The baby, 8 months old, a girl they had named Astrid after Eric's mother, died sometime in the night, so quietly that her mother did not know until morning that the small body in her arms had stopped breathing. The family could not bury her because the ground was frozen 4 feet deep. They wrapped her in the quilt her grandmother had sent from Sweden and placed her in the woodshed, where she would keep until spring came and the earth softened enough to accept her. Old Ezekiel Marsh died alone, which was perhaps fitting for a man who had lived alone for the 30 years since his wife had passed. His cabin stood at the western edge of town, close enough to be visible but far enough that no one thought to check on him until the smoke stopped rising from his chimney. They found him sitting at his kitchen table, his Bible open before him, his hands folded in prayer, his lips frozen around words that those who found him swore were the final lines of the Lord's Prayer. The cold had come for him while he prayed, had taken him in the middle of his conversation with God, and his face held an expression not of fear, but of patience, as if he had simply been waiting for an answer that came in a different form than he expected. Prudence learned of these deaths the way she learned of everything in those weeks, through the thin threads of communication that still connected her hillside to the town below. A boy sent with a message, A woman walking the long, cold road to ask if the mad widow might spare a candle. Fragments of news carried by voices made hoarse by cold and grief. And through it all, she waited. She had 823 jars glowing in her cellar, enough to feed the town for months, if properly rationed. She had knowledge that could save lives, how to stretch provisions, how to preserve what remained, how to read the signs that would tell them when the killing cold would finally break. She had everything Copper Creek needed to survive, and she would give it freely to anyone who asked. But she would not offer what had been mocked. She would not bring her help to doors that had been closed against her. That was not pride, though it might have looked like pride to those who did not understand. It was practicality. Help that is forced upon people who do not want it becomes resented help, becomes help that is wasted, becomes help that teaches nothing. Her grandmother had learned this in the Scottish Highlands, feeding neighbors who sneered at her crofters' ways even as they ate the food her cellars provided. They ate, Moira had written in the leather journal, but they learned nothing, and when the next famine came, they starved again because their bellies remembered but their minds refused. So Prudence waited and counted smoke columns that grew fewer each morning, and spoke to Hickory in the small stable where the horse's breath made clouds that froze on the ceiling. "They will come," she said, running her hands along the mare's warm neck. "Hunger teaches lessons that pride cannot overcome. They will come." The mare pressed her nose against Prudence's shoulder, and Prudence thought she understood. Margaret Coldwell came on December 27th, when the cold had held for 38 days, and the town's remaining provisions could be counted in hours rather than weeks. Prudence saw her coming from a distance, a dark figure against the white landscape, moving with the careful deliberation of someone for whom each step required thought and effort. The path from town to the hillside was treacherous in good weather and nearly impassable now, but Margaret Coldwell climbed it anyway, wrapped in furs that would have fed a family for a month at current prices, her breath freezing in her veil, her hands clenched in muffs that could not quite keep out the cold. She stopped at the edge of Prudence's property, as if uncertain whether the boundary might be enforced, and stood there waiting. Her face, visible through the frost on her veil, held an expression Prudence had never seen on those features before. The simple, honest look of a woman who had nothing left but need. Prudence walked out to meet her. She did not hurry, but neither did she delay. She crossed the frozen ground between her cabin and the property line and stopped 3 feet from the woman who had ensured she received no invitation to any social function in Copper Creek for 4 years. "Mrs. Coldwell," she said. "Widow Prescott." Margaret's voice was rough, stripped of the cultured tone she had cultivated. Cold and grief and weeks of fear had scraped away the polish. "We have nothing left. The store is gone. The cattle are gone. We have been eating the leather from old harnesses. And the children—" Her voice broke and she stopped, and when she continued the words came with difficulty. "My grandchildren are hungry. They cry in the night, and I cannot tell them that food is coming, because I do not know if it is true." Prudence looked at her for a long moment. She thought of the ladies' auxiliary meetings she had not been invited to, the harvest dances where she had not been welcome, the church social committee that had somehow never had room for a mad widow who lived alone on a hillside talking to her horse. She thought of Ephraim Coldwell's voice carrying through the Copper Creek saloon. "She is building her own tomb up there." She thought of her grandmother's hands, rough and calloused, sealing jars in the lamplight of a Minnesota cabin while she talked about the neighbors who had mocked her in Scotland and the children she had fed anyway. "Come inside," Prudence said. "There is much to do." Margaret Coldwell stepped into the cabin, and the warmth hit her like a physical force. She stood just inside the doorway, swaying slightly, and Prudence saw the ice crystals melting on her eyelashes, saw the color beginning to return to cheeks that had gone gray with cold. For a moment neither woman spoke. "Sit by the fire," Prudence said. I will bring you something warm." She heated broth from a jar she had opened that morning and pressed the cup into Margaret's trembling hands. The woman drank without speaking, her eyes closed, and when the cup was empty, she held it against her chest as if the residual warmth was something precious beyond measure. "How many are left?" Prudence asked. Margaret opened her eyes. "In town, perhaps 600 souls still alive. Perhaps fewer. We stopped counting after Ezekiel Marsh. People have stopped coming out of their homes. We do not know who is still burning fires and who has let them go dark. 600 from 847. Nearly 300 dead or fled in less than 6 weeks of true winter." Prudence absorbed this information without expression, though something in her chest tightened at the scale of it. "The children," she said. "How many children?" 112 last we knew, but that count is 8 days old and— Margaret's voice faltered. "Some of them are very weak." Prudence moved to the heavy oak door that led into the hillside. She pushed it open, revealing the vestibule beyond, and gestured for Margaret to follow. The second door swung wide, and lamplight spilled across the shelves, illuminating 823 jars that glowed like captured sunlight against the stone walls. Margaret Coldwell made a sound that was not quite a word. She pressed her hand against her mouth and stood motionless, her eyes moving across the shelves, taking in the abundance that had been waiting here all along while her town starved a mile below. "It is enough," Prudence said quietly. "If we ration carefully, if we teach people how to stretch what they receive, there's enough here to see the town through to spring." Margaret turned to look at her. Tears were running down her face now, cutting channels through the road dust and cold-chapped skin. "Why?" she whispered. "After everything, after what why would you—" "Because hungry children do not care whose parents mocked their neighbors," Prudence said. "And because my grandmother taught me that food is not a weapon. It is a trust. Come, we have work to do." The distribution began the next morning. Prudence would not simply hand out jars to be consumed without thought. That would feed people for weeks, but teach them nothing. And when the next hard winter came, they would starve again. Instead, she organized the giving through the church, which still stood though its roof sagged dangerously under the snow's weight, and she made teaching a condition of receiving. If you are finding wisdom in this tale of preparation and survival, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell for more stories of frontier resilience. Each family that came to receive provisions also received instruction. Prudence showed them how to stretch a jar of preserved vegetables into 3 meals instead of 1. She taught them which foods provided the most sustenance for the least volume, how to recognize when a seal had failed and contents had spoiled, how to ration so that the weakest, the children and the elderly, received what they needed while the strong made do with less. And she began teaching them about next winter, about reading the signs in bird flight and animal movement, about the angle of ventilation shafts and the depth at which Earth maintains a steady temperature, about selecting hillside locations where granite shelves would conduct the planet's deep warmth into spaces carved for storage. Some listened, some did not. But hunger is a teacher that pride cannot overcome, and as the weeks passed and the jars kept coming, 2 per family per week, carefully measured to last until the thaw, more and more of Copper Creek's surviving residents began to understand what the mad widow on the hillside had been doing all along. Ephraim Coldwell did not come himself during those weeks of distribution. He sent his wife, his sons, his grandchildren's nursemaid. He received his family's allotment like everyone else, no more, no less, and Prudence asked no questions about where he was or why he did not show his face. She knew he would come eventually. Pride breaks slowly, but it breaks. The cold held through January. Through February, the deaths continued. An elderly couple who ran out of firewood and were too proud to ask for help. a young mother whose milk failed and whose infant could not digest the substitutes Prudence provided, a rancher who walked into a blizzard and was not found until spring revealed his body in a ravine 3 miles from town. But the pace of dying slowed as Prudence's provisions reached more households, as her teaching took root, as the town that had mocked her learned that survival is not a competition, but a collaboration. By late February, the smoke columns Prudence counted each morning had stabilized at 87. Some had been lost to death, some to abandonment as families fled toward Fort Benson when the roads became marginally passable. But 87 households still burned fires, still sent representatives to the church for their weekly allotment, still listened as the mad widow explained how to prepare for a future they were beginning to believe might actually exist. The final count came later, when the town had time and energy for such accounting. 219 dead, including 14 children under the age of 10. 61 households abandoned entirely. The Coldwell Cattle Company reduced from 3,000 head to fewer than 200. Its hay barns, nothing but blackened timbers visible above the snow. Josiah Finch's general store, a collapsed ruin that would take 2 years to rebuild. The church's roof partially fallen in, its pews serving as firewood for families whose own supplies had failed. And on the hillside above it all, a root cellar that had maintained 40 degrees through temperatures that dropped to 43 below. Its 823 jars slowly diminishing but never exhausted, its double oak doors opening and closing as the mad widow brought summer's abundance to winter's starving children. The thaw came in late March, announced by the crack of ice on the creek and the first tentative dripping of water from eaves that had held solid for 4 months. The temperature rose above freezing on the 23rd, and by the end of the month the snow that had stood 7 feet deep was receding with a speed that seemed almost magical after so many weeks of white imprisonment. The gathering came in April. Reverend Hollister had called it, though everyone knew whose idea it truly was, a town meeting, he said, to discuss the spring and the rebuilding and the future. But when the surviving residents of Copper Creek assembled in the damaged church, filling pews that bore the marks of desperate fires, everyone understood that something else was happening, something that needed to be spoken aloud before the town could truly begin again. Prudence sat in the back row, as she always had during the rare services she attended. She had not asked for this gathering, had not suggested it, had expressed no desire to hear apologies or receive recognition. But she had agreed to come when Margaret Coldwell asked her, because some things must be witnessed to be complete. Ephraim Coldwell stood first. He was thinner than Prudence remembered, his prosperous bulk diminished by weeks of short rations that his money could not augment when there was nothing left to buy. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the back of the pew before him, and his voice, when it came, was nothing like the confident boom that had filled the Copper Creek saloon with mockery. "I said things," he began and stopped, and the church was silent around him. "I stood in the saloon, and I said," he swallowed hard, "I said she was building her own tomb up there. I said she would die in it alone and crazy like her grandmother before her." His voice cracked on the word grandmother, and he pressed on before the break could become a collapse. "I lost my cattle. 3,000 head frozen in the fields or burned when my own men tried to save them. I lost my hay barns and the grain stored in them. I lost 2 of my cowboys to the cold and 1 to the fire, and I watched my grandson." He stopped again, and this time the silence stretched. "I watched my grandson crying with hunger in his mother's arms, and I could not help him. I, who had controlled 60% of this valley's commerce, could not find a single scrap of food to put in my grandson's mouth." He turned slowly to face the back of the church where Prudence sat. "The jars you gave us kept my family alive. The knowledge you shared is already changing how we think about next winter and the winter after that. I mocked you for building something I called a folly, and that folly saved the people I love most in this world." His voice had steadied now, though his eyes were bright with moisture. "I ask your forgiveness, Widow Prescott. I ask it knowing I do not deserve it, knowing that nothing I say can undo the 4 years of exclusion my words encouraged. But I ask it anyway, because my grandson is alive, and you are the reason why." He sat down heavily, and for a moment no one moved. Margaret Coldwell rose next. Her voice was softer than her husband's, but no less laden with the weight of what she carried. "I kept you out of the ladies' auxiliary," she said, turning to face Prudence directly. "I made sure your name was never suggested for the church social committee or the harvest dance planning or any of the dozen other ways a woman joins the life of a town. I told myself you were not suited for such things, that a widow who talked to her horse and dug in the hillside like a badger was not the sort of company respectable women should keep." She pressed her hands together as if in prayer, though the gesture seemed more desperate than devout. "I nearly died walking to your door. The cold was so deep I thought my lungs would freeze before I reached your property line. And when I got there, you invited me inside. You fed me broth from your stores. You asked about the children as if they were your own concern, as if the town that had shunned you still mattered to you anyway." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You had every right to turn me away. You had every right to let us starve on our own pride. But you did not, and I will carry the shame of how I treated you until the day I die. I ask your forgiveness, knowing I do not deserve it." Josiah Finch stood next, the general store owner who had raised his eyebrows at Prudence's jar purchases, who had whispered with customers about the mad widow's strange preparations. "I charged you full price for those jars," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been guilt. 200 jars in August of '86, and I knew you could not afford them, and I charged you every cent anyway because I thought—" He stopped, shook his head. "I thought you were wasting your money on foolishness. I thought the jars would sit empty on your shelves while you realized that Montana winters are not Scottish famines, and that all your grandmother's wisdom was just an old woman's fear." He turned to face her, a big man made small by the winter's lessons. "My store collapsed. Everything I had worked 30 years to build is buried under snow and broken timbers. But my daughter and her children are alive because of what you stored in those jars I sold you. The foolishness I mocked turned out to be the only wisdom in this whole frozen valley." He swallowed. "I ask your forgiveness for every raised eyebrow, every whispered conversation, every moment I contributed to making you feel unwelcome in your own town." Reverend Hollister rose last, and his confession was perhaps the hardest to hear because he had been the one she had tried to warn. "You came to me in October," he said. "You told me about the elk coming down early, about the geese leaving a full month ahead of their usual time, about the winter birds that had not appeared. You told me that the signs pointed to a killing season, and you asked me to help prepare the town." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I patted your arm. I told you that you should attend more Sunday services instead of communing with creatures. I dismissed everything you tried to tell me because I believed that God's providence would protect us, that faith was stronger than preparation, that a woman's observations about birds and animals could not possibly carry the weight of prophecy." He looked at the damaged roof above them, at the pews scarred by desperate fires, at the congregation diminished by death and departure. Thomas Yancey was 14 years old. Astrid Lindqvist was 8 months old. Ezekiel Marsh was praying when the cold took him. I do not know if God heard his prayers or if God simply had other plans. But I know that I failed this town when I refused to listen to warnings that came from observation rather than Scripture. His eyes met Prudence's across the length of the church. "I ask your forgiveness for my arrogance, for the lives that might have been saved if I had helped you prepare this town instead of dismissing your wisdom as something less than faith." The church fell silent. 4 confessions given, 4 voices stilled, and every eye turned to the back row where Prudence Prescott sat with her hands folded in her lap and her expression unreadable. She stood slowly. The walk to the front of the church seemed longer than the building could account for, and when she turned to face the congregation, she did not speak immediately. She looked at them, at the faces she had watched from her hillside window, at the smoke columns she had counted each morning, at the town that had excluded her and then survived on her provisions. "My grandmother told me," she began, and her voice was steady, "that forgiveness is not a gift we give. It is a truth we teach." She paused, letting the words settle. Moira Brennan survived 3 famines in the Scottish Highlands before she crossed the ocean to a country that had never known true hunger. She learned that when the worst comes, people will mock the preparation they do not understand. They will laugh at cellars dug into hillsides. They will call wisdom foolishness, because wisdom looks like fear to those who have never been afraid. Her gaze moved across the congregation, meeting eyes, acknowledging faces. She also learned that when the worst arrives, those same people will come hungry to the doors they mocked. And she learned that feeding them is not about forgiveness. It is about survival, theirs and ours. Because a community that lets its members starve out of spite is not a community worth surviving in. She straightened her shoulders, and her voice grew stronger. "I did not keep you alive because I forgave you. I kept you alive because my grandmother taught me that food is not a weapon, and children are not responsible for their parents' cruelty. I kept you alive because somewhere in those 823 jars was the memory of Moira Brennan, sealing preserves in the lamplight, teaching me that the point of surviving is to ensure that others can survive too." For a moment, the church held its breath. "I will not tell you that your words did not wound me," Prudence continued. "They did. 4 years of exclusion leaves marks that do not wash away with one season of need. But I will tell you this: the wounds matter less than what we build from their lessons." She looked at Ephraim Coldwell, at his wife, at Josiah Finch and Reverend Hollister and all the faces that had turned away from her and were now turned toward her with something that looked like hope. "I will teach anyone who wishes to learn," she said. "How to read the signs. How to build cellars that hold the earth's warmth. How to preserve abundance against inevitable scarcity. Not because I forgive what was done, but because the next generation should not have to learn these lessons through death. Come to me when the ground thaws. Bring your questions and your willingness to work, and we will build something together that mockery cannot touch." She sat down without another word, and the silence that followed was not empty but full of things understood, things resolved, things beginning. The first new root cellar broke ground in May of 1888 on the hillside just south of Prudence's own. Ephraim Coldwell himself swung the first pickaxe, his hands blistering within hours on work he had never done before, his body learning what his money had always purchased for him. Prudence stood beside him, guiding his stroke, teaching him to read the granite's grain as Davies had taught her. If this story of redemption and wisdom resonates with you, consider sharing it with others who might find meaning in tales of community rebuilt through humility and hard work. Within 3 years, 17 cellars dotted the hillsides around Copper Creek. Within 10 years, the number had risen to 34. Each builder came to Prudence first, walked the land with her, learned to test ground temperature and redstone quality and calculate the angles of ventilation shafts. Some built quickly, eager to prepare for winters they now understood could kill. Others worked slowly, savoring the labor as a kind of penance. All of them learned. The phrase emerged organically, as such phrases do, growing from the soil of shared experience and repeated use. Building a folly, people began to say, but the words had lost their mockery. When someone announced they were building a folly, it meant they were preparing for the worst, reading signs others could not see, investing in survival while others laughed. The widow's folly had become widow's folly without the possessive, not her foolishness but a kind of wisdom, a tradition, a legacy. Hickory died in the spring of 1892, 17 years old and gentle to the end. Prudence buried the mare on the hillside overlooking the valley, in a spot where the morning sun fell warm and the view stretched to the mountains in the west. She did not weep at the graveside, but she stood there for a long time after the last shovel of earth was packed down, and when she finally walked away she was speaking softly, words no one else could hear, a conversation with a companion who had listened without judgment through all the years of mockery and all the months of vindication. The Coldwell family rebuilt slowly. Ephraim never recovered his former dominance. The winter had broken something in him that prosperity could not heal, but his grandsons grew up working alongside their grandmother in the cellar she and Prudence built together, and they learned to read weather in animal bones and bird flight. When Ephraim died in 1903, the obituary in the Copper Creek Gazette noted that his cellar had survived him and was still providing for his family. Reverend Hollister preached differently after that winter. His sermons spoke less of providence and more of preparation, less of faith as passive waiting and more of faith as active labor. He quoted Prudence more often than he realized, her grandmother's wisdom woven into his words until it became indistinguishable from Scripture. When he died in 1899, his successor found a worn leather journal among his effects, a copy he had made of passages from Moira Brennan's original, with notes in the margins about how the Highland crofter's wisdom applied to Montana Territory's particular challenges. Prudence never married again. She never seemed to want to. Her life filled itself with other things. The endless parade of students seeking her instruction, the children who came to help with her garden and left knowing how to read cloud formations, the young couples who consulted her before selecting land for their homesteads. She became something between a fixture and a legend, the mad widow who had been right all along, the keeper of knowledge that the valley could not afford to lose. The formal teaching began in 1908, when Prudence was 51, and the third generation since the White Death was reaching adulthood. She organized classes in the rebuilt church, monthly gatherings where she shared everything her grandmother had taught her and everything she had learned since. Attendance was voluntary but consistently high. The memory of 1887 had not faded, passed down in family stories and community rituals that ensured no child in Copper Creek grew up without understanding what their town had survived. By 1920, 62 root cellars lined the hillsides around Copper Creek, and the town had weathered 3 more hard winters without a single death from cold or hunger. The methods had spread beyond the valley, carried by families who relocated and travelers who passed through, and agricultural agents who recognized in widow's folly a system worth documenting. A professor from the State University came in 1923 to interview Prudence for a monograph on frontier food preservation. The resulting publication credited the Prescott method and included detailed diagrams based on Moira Brennan's original sketches. Prudence Prescott died on October 14, 1931. She was 74 years old, and she died in her sleep in the cabin she had built 48 years earlier, with the door to her root cellar standing open as it always did, as if the connection between her living space and the stored abundance below was too essential to ever fully close. Her body was found by Margaret Coldwell's great-granddaughter, a young woman named Clara who had been bringing fresh bread as she did every week, continuing a tradition of small kindnesses that had begun when her great-grandmother walked through waist-deep snow to beg for help from the woman she had excluded. The funeral drew more people than the town had seen gathered since the reckoning in the church 44 years before. They came from the valley and beyond, former students and their children's children, families who had survived hard winters on provisions stored according to her instructions, builders who had carved cellars according to her designs. Ephraim Coldwell's grandson spoke at the service, his voice breaking as he described how his grandmother Margaret had walked that terrible mile to ask for help, how Prudence's response had taught his family more about grace than any sermon ever could. The original cellar still stands. Its oak doors are weathered now, their iron hinges marked by rust that careful maintenance keeps from spreading. The double entrance remains functional, its vestibule still packed with earth that breathes through the seasons as Moira Brennan designed it to breathe. The shelving inside has been rebuilt twice, replaced as wood aged and warped, but the layout remains exactly as Prudence first constructed it. 18 tiers on each wall, each shelf reinforced to bear the weight of filled jars, each position numbered according to a system recorded in the journal that now resides in the town's small historical society. Tourists visit sometimes, directed by signs along the main road that identify the site as a National Register of Historic Places. They walk the path that Margaret Coldwell climbed through waist-deep snow, and they stand before the brass plaque that was affixed to the oak door on the first anniversary of Prudence's death. The plaque bears 5 words, chosen by Clara Coldwell after much consultation with those who had known Prudence best, those who understood what the cellar represented and why it mattered. The words catch sunlight in the morning and reflect lamplight when visitors come after dark, and they say, "Every jar is a promise kept." Moira would have understood exactly what her granddaughter meant.